So today we want to talk about Symantec PGP, particularly PGP 3.2. Now this is broken down into two products. We have PGP Desktop and PGP Universal Server. And the reason I break it down into two separate products is because PGP Desktop is kind of its own standalone piece of software that runs on client machines. It's what unlocks your PGP whole disk encryption features. There's a lot of standalone features. It can be managed by a PGP Universal Server, although that doesn't have to be the case. It can run without one. You can also create encrypted external disks with your PGP Desktop system. You can do hard drives, removable media, stuff like that. Just encrypt those and make them more secure. You can also create encrypted zip files, and we'll talk about more of that in a second. Again, it's what runs on the client side. So instead of calling it the PGP client, we call it the PGP Desktop because it's its own standalone software. We also have PGP Universal Server. This is the management interface for PGP Desktop. This is where you can manage policies and groups, create new users, manage their keys, stuff like that. You can also remove and enable features on the PGP Desktop. This is really cool. So I was just mentioning the encrypting external disks and zip files. Those are all features that are default turned on in PGP Desktop. But with the Universal Server, you can actually create a client install or even change policies. And users, if you want to, let's say, you know what, I don't want my user to have encrypted external disks. I just want them to be able to encrypt their own disk or encrypt their own data. I don't want them to be able to make an external, like maybe a removable thumb drive that's encrypted. So what you do is you uncheck that box in the Universal Server, and quite literally on the client side, on the PGP Desktop, not only is that feature just not, like, it's not there, but it's not grayed out. It's not like you can't click the tab anymore. It's that feature's just missing. Like, you don't even see it as an option anymore. So it's a really cool way to remove features, just so that the user doesn't even know that they were available. They're just gone. Just a quick rundown on encryption. Some of you might not be aware of this or might not know entirely how the process works. I know some of you do, and I'm not trying to like dumb down the conversation or anything. I just want everybody to be on the same page. So I want to talk a little bit about how encryption works and the two types of encryption. So there's asymmetric and symmetric. So asymmetric encryption works like this. You have public keys and private keys. And one key, the private key, is used for decryption, and the public key is used for encryption. And users can have several types of those keys. They can have, their own personal public and private keys. But if they're belonging to groups, let's say, in a universal server, or if they have several groups that they belong to, several groups might be using keys, public and private keys, and that belongs to an entire group. So a certain group of people will share personal and private keys. So let's talk about a scenario here. I use your public key, and I encrypt a message, and I send it to you, and you receive it. And since it's used your public key, the only key that can decrypt it is your private key. So as you can see, this creates a scenario where having your public key available to everybody doesn't really mean a whole lot. You can just use your public key and get handed out freely. That's why you'll hear a lot of people, if you've ever been to a encryption event or a PGP event or some sort of, if you ever can go to an event where they have like a booth or a table, if you've heard of getting your public key signed by that particular vendor or getting it signed by a PGP person, like it's kind of a thing just to get that signed, to get that done. And the reason why it's freely available, you can just kind of wear it on your sleeve and nobody really cares, is because you don't have to use your public key privately. It's something that you can hand out for free. And the only real thing about that's why that works that way is because you need to have the private key as well. That's like me sending you a message, and I send it to you in a locked box, and I know you have the key. Now, again, that's called asymmetric encryption. Symmetric encryption is kind of the same idea. It scrambles data, which is kind of a nice way of putting it, is that it scrambles data. But it also creates its key at that point when it's scrambling the data to unscramble it. So if you want to send a message with symmetric encryption, it's slightly more security vulnerable because you can take that scrambled data and you have to send the key along with it or in a separate message. But that's like me, again, going back to me giving you, shipping you a box with sensitive stuff in it. I send you a box with asymmetric, and you already have the key. But with symmetric, I send you that data again, but I have to send you the key along with it. Now, if that message gets intercepted, you have a problem because the key is sitting right next to the box. You don't have security that way. You completely ruin it. So symmetric encryption does have its purposes. I'm not saying it's completely insecure. I'm saying for sending messages it's unsecure, and that's why we have asymmetric encryption. Now there's also organization keys, which are kind of a little bit different than public and private keys. Organization keys are what identifies your organization as, identifies a PGP server as belonging to or a member of that PGP structure belonging to that PGP server. So each cluster or each server can only have one organization key. If you're in a cluster, they're replicated across the cluster. You can import it from other systems for migration purposes. Again, that's just, in case you have a PGP server you want to bring back up or move for whatever reason, then you can have the organization key move from one server to the other. But when you do that, it'll wipe out the old one, because again, there can only be one. A lot of things refer back to this within the PGP system. It'll look back and say, oh yeah, I need to look at the organization key in order to do that. So it's kind of the root. It's where all the other keys come from. It's kind of like the parent key, and then all the other keys are kind of like the child keys. So I mentioned clustering a little bit already. Let's talk about that more. So there's a cluster option on the PGP Universal Server. You can link up to 6, but you need to have at least one primary server. And that's kind of, again, the guy who's controlling everything. Anything that's put on that server and there's replication to it or from it is pushed to the other servers in its cluster member. We call it, of course, replication. So again, one guy has to be controlling everything. And we'll talk about that more. I actually have a demo coming up here, and I'll show you the clustering option, kind of a little bit how it works. You can also have cluster members outside of the DMZ. This is more useful for webmail and encrypting mail that way, so people can still get in from outside the company, hit that mail server, hit that PGP server that's handling the mail, and can still get their encrypted email without actually being a member of the organization. That uses the symmetric that we had just talked about. That uses the symmetric encryption. And because stuff is sitting on the DMZ, of course, you don't want to have replicated data going to it sometimes, especially if it's stuff like keys or passwords, stuff like that, user information. So what you do is you actually can turn off replication information. Some information you actually can limit what goes out or how whose information is out on the DMZ. You can even turn it off completely, so information to the DMZ doesn't get replicated besides user confirmation, pretty much. So let's talk about LDAP integration. It is a feature. It's Turn Active Directory integration, and all that really allows is two things. First of all, single sign-on at start. When a user first turns on their computer and they have PGP enabled, instead of bringing them to a Windows logon screen, it'll actually have a PGP logon, and they go in through that. And by having the Windows single sign-on, it'll do the domain access, everything. So users aren't typing in their password or their username or their domain, 3 or 4 times just to get into their own computers. It'll just do it all at once. Also, instead of having user manually enter their credentials every single time a new user comes in, they'll just have to do it once, and then that user will always be in the system. And that'll be happening on the first logon. So the first time a user goes into the system, it'll grab all their LDAP credentials, it'll grab everything that they need, everything the user needs to further use the system. So you don't have to manually enter it all yourself as an IT person. The database for all the keys and the users, that's all built in. It's an on-box database system. There's no need for SQL or Oracle connections. I almost prefer it that way in this case. Now, for some of you, that might sound like a limitation, but I would counter that with saying it stops you from having to create a SQL cluster or spin up a SQL cluster or go through a database administrator for spin up. PGP and Symantec have said that they want this to be, within a few hours, you want to be able to bring the server up. Maybe not have it running and completely configured, but at least have the server on and running. And that should actually give you a key as to how the simplicity of the server actually is, and we'll actually see that in a second. Virtual server. Now this is the virtual machine of mine that's actually running the PGP Universal Server. If I click here, we'll get our screen back. Now you see this is all that's being displayed. So if you try to RDP in or if you're in a hypervisor and trying to look in to the actual PGP universal server, this is all you're going to see. Now, there's two reasons for this. One of them is because, for security purposes, is that you can't get in by just accessing the server. You actually have to have a web console, and that's the second portion. So let's go to a machine that actually is on the same network as this one. And that was the server I just had up. Now you'll see this is a management interface, but if you notice, I'm running it through Internet Explorer. So the interface for the management portion is all done through a browser. Very nice, cross-platform, really simple way to get into things. So this is the reporting screen. You see a system overview here. You can kind of see where systems are at, what's being used, what features are turned on or stopped, or if there's any issues with any features. You know, typical reporting data. Again, graphs. If you have some logs or some reporting that you have automated or turned on, all done here. Again, very simple, pretty straightforward system for the reporting. Let's look at consumers real quick. And the consumers tab is usually what I like to say is the home tab, so to speak. It's where a lot of the meat and potatoes is for me managing the system. So you have your download client option, and it's really this simple. You click on it, and this is exactly how you get a client if you're trying to create an MSI to push out to your machine, so your users. This is how you do it. Now, however you choose to do that, completely up to you. You can do an email link. You can have them go to this. However you want to do it. They select what they want, or you select what you want to send out, language, all that. Again, you'll notice that does Mac OS as well. You can pick what kind of client. There's also universal satellite, which we don't really touch on a whole lot. We highly recommend using PGP Desktop instead. Pick your language. You can customize what policy group you want it in. I have a testing group. We can put it in. You can also auto-detect a policy group using the email address. Again, that goes back to LDAP credentials. You can also have an embedded policy group, so just use that person's, so I have this test policy group. If I embed that policy group, what happens is I actually I take that policy, and it actually gets embedded in this client, and then it will never contact the server again. It will just assume, oh, these are the policies I run with, don't do anything else. So that's kind of handy. And you can actually tell it which PGP server to connect to. And the reason that's an option is because you can also have, like I said, cluster members. And if you have a certain member of the cluster you'd rather have it connect to, you could do it that way. So I'm not going to download a client now. I'm just going to leave it like that, but I just want to show you guys the options. So you can create groups here, give it a name, type in maybe a short description for yourself or other administrator users. You can apply policies from a different group, and for inheritance reasons. You can also create a group key. Very nice feature if you guys want to have a certain group that can only read messages or access certain data. It's a good way to control who can see what. Again, here's some domain options. This should all be very, very intuitive if you've used other management consoles for other pieces of software. So let's go to the users page real quick. Now this is kind of limited. I only have some clients working. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say working. I have several users here that I've done for testing purposes. You'll see probably no external users, yeah. So we only have some internal users. They're all functioning in the system, but they haven't been added from the desktop client side as per the norm. They've been added from my side. I've just added an internal user. So they won't have complete functionality, but we can still play with them a little bit. So let's open up this testing 1, 2, 3 guy, and you can see if you want to import a public key. If you don't generate a user from the PGP Desktop side, so if if that doesn't run and they don't enroll through that, then this will always be blank because that'll generate their key for them. I also create a passphrase for them, what groups they belong to, everyone. I also put them in the test group, so they belong to 2 groups. What permissions they have, so United permissions. So they currently don't have permissions, and we can always be like, oh, they can read, they can use these keys, they can use those keys. So maybe an executive, a particular executive in your company, if you want to give them the range of using all the keys or any key that they want within a certain range of permissions, all very doable from here. Let's go back. So we talk about managed keys again here, what they're using. See, this current user is not using anything. They're not in charge of any keys because they haven't generated their own yet. what email address they're using. This guy's using, PGP example, and that'll plug in for LDAP credentials. We haven't generated a certificate for them yet. You can also see what disks they're managing or what disks they've encrypted if they have that capability unlocked on their PGP desktop. So you'll see that it's not doing anything. Again, we haven't done the enrollment from the PGP desktop side. But if it was, you'd see the whole list. You'd have the computer, what the computer name is here. So typical Windows computer, whatever you named it in your Active Directory, or whatever the computer's spitting out. So you'll have probably one computer here, and then underneath that computer you'll have several disk IDs scrolling down. What partition it is, what the name of the partition is, the size, type, so on and so forth. Again, very common information to see. The biggest thing here that you might not be used to is WDRT, and all it stands for is Whole Disk Recovery Token. So if you want to generate a Whole Disk Recovery Token, all that is pretty much your ticket out. If you ever lose a password or username, or if somebody is refusing to enter in credentials to get to an encrypted device, what you do is you generate a Whole Disk Recovery Token. It looks just like these kind of buttons right here. You just click it, a little pop-up screen pops up and says, okay, here's the disk ID, here's the computer, here's the username, and here's the Whole Disk Recovery Token. And then on that encrypted disk, you actually say, hey, I'm going to use a Whole Disk Recovery Token instead of my regular credentials to get on. And then it'll let you on from there. So again, it's kind of like your free ticket in. If you keep generating them, it'll always use the most recent one. It won't use any more than that. Again, it'll notify you of that too when you use it. It'll say, hey, you can only use one Whole Disk Recovery Token right now. So if you don't want to, if you're trying to find just a specific disk instead of going by who owns the disk, so you get in through here. Now currently we don't have any Whole Disk enabled computers, but we do have a managed device here, and this is what you'll see. This is the machine I'm using right now. That's the machine name. So you'll see that under, if we go back to the users page, you'll see that right here, and then how many, like let's say that has several hard drives in it, which of those disks, it'll give each of those an ID, and then what size they are, and it'll also find the common name. So if it's like a caviar disk or something like that, it'll have the name of the disk right here. So you might have 4 of the same hard drive in there, so that's why it also gives it a disk ID, so you can tell which disk you're unencrypting. Okay, so let's look at our policies. Now, this might be a little bit confusing to some. Again, we have our default excluded in test, which probably looks a lot like our groups, everyone excluded in test. So I always kind of make that differentiation between these two, because you need to have, so the testing group is using the default policy. Let's actually go and change that. Here we go. Everyone in test is using this policy. So I have a test policy that's up, as I already pointed out. Nobody's using it, just 0 people are using it, or 0 groups are using it. But there's a difference between groups and policies, despite the fact that some of them having the same name. You can add policies quite easily. I always like the option to clone from one of the 2 policies. So again, I created my own. So there's something you want to start with and kind of change. Maybe there's only one setting in a policy you want to change, but you don't want to have to go back and delete that policy. So I really like testing 101. There's one thing I want to change in it. So I want to keep test 01 because some people are using that and I like that they're using it. But it's very similar to a policy I want to create. So I just go from there and just save it that way. Maybe type in a little, and I'll give a little description. If I don't like that anymore, if I only want to use it for a brief moment or for whatever I want to use it for, there's always the option to go on and delete it. And since nobody's using it, I don't get a panic attack. Let's talk about keys. We have the group key for test 01 because I generated one for it, and you also have the organization key here. Now there is an export option. Again, it's just seriously this simple. You just mouse over it, click it. You can also export the key pair. I always recommend doing encrypting the key pairs and then decrypting with the passphrase later. And the reason for that is if you have to move this because it actually will. Let's say I'm just going to I'll show you guys. Export it. I'm literally going to export this key pair. I'm going to save it. I'm actually going to put it right on my desktop. So now you ask, well, how would I get it onto a new server? And one of the ways you do that would be, see, there it is right there. One of the ways you do that would be to possibly put it on a thumb drive or put it on a network drive. But now you're running into the problem of, how do I keep that secure while I'm moving it? And the answer is encrypting it. So that's more for if you want to move servers or have your clients jump servers, or you're bringing up a new server, or if you're trying to do a little bit of clustering. That's what that option is for. Let's talk about the mail real quick. Now, there's basically webmail. Actually, you know what? You're going to get a better view of the services. Here we go. I prefer to look at mail from this way. This is, I feel, not incredibly important to understand, because you're going to set it up once and then that's going to be it. So you can see mail proxies. So we even turn on mail stream functions on this particular server. That's all determined by your license, what's open. So that's why I don't really like to talk about it much. The main thing that you need to know is your web messenger enabled or disabled. And if it's enabled, then people, like, especially if they're coming in from the DMZ, you can hit this web address up here. You can even hit that IP address, and they can hit it and try to enter credentials to get in, and that's for sending external users or external colleagues, however you want to say that, people external to the company and not in the PGP network. That's to send them encrypted data, and then they come into the web messenger, and that encrypted data is all done through Outlook. You actually say, oh yeah, Outlook, please send this as a protected message. You enable that feature. It's not automated. That email goes out, the person gets it, and they read it, and it says, oh, so-and-so from this particular domain or this particular network or this organization is trying to send you an encrypted message. Click this link to read it. So you click the link, it brings you back to the webmail login. Excuse me. Webmail login. You go in through there, and it will unencrypt the message for you, and that's going back to the symmetric encryption. Let's take one last look at the system. This is the last thing I really want to talk about here, and then I'm going to be done. So you can see what the server name is, what the server version is, what time it thinks it is. Obviously, it might be a little bit off, 11:05. So you can change the time here, and this is all very important to have. I would recommend doing an NTP server, only because the NTP server is going to be accurate, more accurate. And the reason you want accuracy is for certificate usage. So having certificates being on the right time and making sure that the times sync up is actually very good for certificate authentication. If you guys are familiar with certificates, then you understand why that's important. And if you're not, just know that having the right time on the server is actually pretty important, or having it very close to the right time. So you have services, restart, stop all services. Again, looking at the services tab, it's just this stuff, whatever you've enabled with your license. So you can stop all, restart all, and you also get the same option for the server, restart the server, shut down the server, that kind of stuff. And I have administrator tab here. You see that I have an admin user already plugged in. That's what I used when the first time I logged into this. I had the admin, use my admin credentials. One good thing to note is that just because an admin is in here does not mean that they're actually over, and I'm going to quick jump here, so I'm sorry if this is kind of a whirlwind. Go back to our users tab. So you don't see an admin user right here. That's because these are just the users, and these are the administrator users. It's kept in two separate areas. So let's say I have an IT guy on my staff. His name is Nick. Nick might have a user entry over here, internal users, and he might have some PGP, client desktop, PGP desktop on his machine. And so he's able to do all, his typical user stuff. But Nick is also on my IT staff, and I want to make sure that he's able to use the PGP Universal Server. So I come over here and also give him admin. So just because Nick's over here on admin doesn't necessarily mean that it's using the same credentials. He might have a different admin password. It's treated as two separate login instances. All I'm trying to differentiate here, guys, is that these guys over here have nothing to do with those users over here. They're two separate things. I can't right-click on this and say, oh, make this person an admin user too. You have to enter them manually by another admin user in this group. So let's actually see what that's like. Let's add an admin user. Just call test. That's my network name. I'm just gonna make sure this is all right. Cool. Some of it is a read-only administrator. I can pick, let's say I want to have him be a super user. What I really like about PGP, it always explains to you what it's about to do. If you have a question about something or something's usually not clear, you can usually mouse over a button and it'll tell you exactly what's going to happen. You know, cancel and save, we understand. But maybe some of those other terms like that import button that we were looking at earlier. So let's look at this guy right here. See, there we go. There's a good example. You see, you're like, what does that button do? I don't understand. Oh, okay, I get to add that type of key. You can also send a daily status email if that's a user or an executive user who wants to see status of the server every day. You can go ahead and enter that right there. Again, so you kind of get to pick. Let's make them a basic administrator and just save it. So see, now we have test admin here. You see how the icon's different because he's a different type of user, and he has never logged in yet, so we can see that. You're like, you know what? I don't want to have him Mr. Test Admin have privileges anymore. I'm just going to get rid of him. So yep, that is going to delete the entire consumer record. I'm aware. Go ahead, and he's gone. So it's really that easy. Last thing I want to talk about is, if you ever want to see your network settings or change them, again, this is very useful for moving servers within your network or clustering. So you can easily change it all from here. Very simple interface. So let's go to clustering real quick. So you see two options here. It might not be obvious right away, but we have add a cluster member. And it's as simple as, oh, there's another PGP server up. Here's its address, here's its host name, whatever I want to use. And then if that's like a webmail server that's already located in the DMZ, go ahead and say, hey, yeah, it's on the DMZ. But you know what? I don't want to host private keys for internal users and consumer groups. That seems like a security risk. Let's turn that off. It's still located in the DMZ, but let's turn that feature off so I'm not putting sensitive information out there for people to potentially grab and take. Go over here, enter in whatever you want to put in for your cluster member, hit OK. Another option is when you're installing actually for the first time, PGP Universal Server will ask you, is this going to be a cluster member, or is this going to be a main, like is this going to be a primary member? So your default is primary member, but I'd highly recommend, if it's going to be part of a cluster, doing it then, because it will save you the headache of doing this. And this is a server that you're going to add to a cluster because you're trying to combine maybe domains, something similar to that. Go ahead and hit join cluster here. Again, you're just going to enter in the host name or IP address of the primary member, and then go ahead and hit save, and it's just going to join it right up. So that's PGP Universal Server. I'm glad you guys all came in today. Really happy to show you this piece of software.